Placement of team of persons, including a student's parents, reviews the student's IEP, determines the least restrictive environment, least restrictive setting in which special education and related services can be implemented in an appropriate manner. That's the case conference committee with the parents. Looks at that IEP, makes their decision regarding where the child should be placed. Now, placement we often think of as a setting, but it's actually much more than that. It's the facilities, it's the personnel, location, equipment. It's like a web of services. So placement, if we don't have the appropriate facilities or equipment needed in one setting, that's not an appropriate setting then. We have to look at all those services that are being offered. Now, the federal law goes on to say, in determining the educational placement of a child with a disability, including the preschool child with a disability, each public agency must ensure that the placement decision is made based on the IEP. Placement is based on the IEP. That's an important thing to remember. That's required federal law. It's even more strictly, it's even more strictly required in the articles in Article 7. Also, when your team determines the educational placement of a child with a disability, when you select the least restrictive environment, you are allowed to give consideration, and you must give consideration, to any potential harmful effects on the child or on the quality of services that he or she needs. So again, that's the appropriate piece. Is that setting appropriate? Is there any possible harm in that setting when you make that decision? Those are legitimate decisions. Now, the next decision is virtually verbatim in Article 7 from the federal law. And it says, when you as a team are determining the educational placement of a child with a disability, or if you're in preschool and determining the placement of a preschool child with a disability, you have to ensure that a child with a disability is not removed from education, age-appropriate regular classrooms solely because you need to make modifications in general ed. That would not be a sufficient reason for removing a child from special ed. So you have to ask, in essence, is there something we can do in the general ed setting? This is before you decide to move to a more restrictive setting. Are there supplementary aids and services we could provide in the general education setting that'll allow the child to receive an appropriate education there? Interesting section out of Article 7. It said, each student with a disability has an equal opportunity to participate with non-disabled students in non-academic and extracurricular services and activities to the maximum extent appropriate. What does that mean? Well, that means if your school offers any non-academic activities, like if it has clubs during the school day or activities during the school day, or extracurricular activities like after-school sports, after-school clubs, students with disabilities have to be given an equal opportunity to participate in those activities too. What you need to do in Indiana, this is the way I interpret this regulation, is if a child wants to try out for wrestling or whatever, you need to give them an equal opportunity to try out. That doesn't mean they have to be in it. In fact, you could include something to the language of equal opportunity to participate in the IEP. But, usually with after-school extracurricular sports, there's a certain level of skill that is necessary for a child to make the team. If your child tries out and doesn't make a team, if he doesn't have the skills, that's fine. That's the way it is. But you mustn't disallow them the opportunity to at least try out. There was a recent OCR ruling involving a young man who happened to be a really good runner, very good in track, but he was deaf. He wanted to try out for the track team. And the school wouldn't let them. And, well, the parents met and they said, why can't he try out for the track team? Well, they said, he can't hear the gun when the race starts. So it doesn't make any sense. Well, the parents said, well, can't you do a visual signal? Or, he can't hear it, but you could do like waving at the same time. They said, no, because that would give other students an unfair advantage. They complained with OCR. Our OCR said, oh no, you have to give that disabled child a chance to try out. So that's a real important thing. And it's kind of related to this. Federal law doesn't say this. State law does, though. Another one unique to Indiana, take steps to make available to students with disabilities the variety of educational programs and services that are made available to non-disabled students served by the school, including the following: vocational education, art, music, industrial arts, consumer and homemaker education, field trips, and physical education. So in other words, they have to be available to all kids. Another thing, and this is probably the most important thing in everything we do, parents' crucial role, that we've got to ensure that parents are part of the group that determines the student's placement. And if neither parent can participate in the placement meeting or the CCC meeting, the LEA must ensure their participation through other means. I mean, you can do video conferencing, conference calls, Skype, GoToMeeting. Any of those things are fine. Federal law says you can use technology, just make darn sure the parents are involved. Interest appears without disabilities. A number of courts and even the federal government has said if the child is so disruptive that the education of other students is significantly impaired, regular class placement would not be appropriate. So that is a very legitimate consideration. Some irrelevant factors. Don't base placement on a category of disability. Now, it may be you have a special program for youngsters with autism, but you can't just go in and say, well, the child's going to be educated over at such and such school, now let's plan the program. That's illegal. You could say, well, let's plan the program in where can we deliver this? Well, these facilities, we have this program over here, may be a very appropriate placement, but you can't just say carte blanche, you've got to take this program. Same thing with severity of disability. You can't base any decisions on availability. You can't say, for example, oh, sorry, we don't have that placement here. Those continuums have to be available. Can't use cost. You can actually use cost if you have two equally appropriate placements, but one would be a lot more expensive. So cost can be a consideration, but it can't be the only consideration.